So the fourth of our 8 insights from our studies of elections in 10 countries in 2024 was that digital technologies and social media platforms seem to be spreading hateful content, hyperemotive content, and driving polarization that's making offline political processes more difficult. Now, this idea of digital technologies spreading hate and contributing to an increased polarization that we've seen for many years is something that people have been thinking about for a very long time. And this is in many ways wrapped up in the way that the dominant platforms that we are using today work. So if you think about the majority of big social media sites that are being used, they are all big commercial platforms. They're all being driven by their commercial bottom line. And the way that they make money, in general, when we're talking about the majority of these sites, is through advertising. Through advertising from the eyes of the users coming in and seeing these things on the page. So it is basically their business model to be drawing users back as many times as possible during the day to create content that is clicked on, because this is how the advertising functions work. And so that privileges content that is attention grabbing and emotive and feels urgent, focused on a particular issue right now and giving you the impression that, oh, I need to check back later today, or I need to check this. So it really doesn't matter whether you read the article, it really doesn't matter whether you believe the headline or whether you think that it's a complete hoax. If you click on it, your eyes have seen it, your eyes have seen the adverts. And all of these are skewed towards what is good for these sites, right? These sites are where politics is often being done now, where so much political communication and civic engagement is happening, but this is not what they are structured to do. Within the academic community, there are lots and lots of research studies that have looked at these phenomenon. And because they're so focused, you get different results. There's a real split within the academic community about these ideas, particularly around polarization and how much polarization you see online, and different people experiencing different amounts of polarization. But one thing that was different about our study and what we were doing in this piece of research, where we were doing very deep and broad comparisons, so deep into specific countries and then broad across the political systems, is unlike this very, very focused academic research that may be looking at a particular hashtag on a particular platform. We were able to look more broadly across the entire election, both what was happening online and the context of the country and what was happening offline. And we saw lots of instances in which you saw either a direct or an indirect connection between this hateful, emotive, hyperpartisan speech online and then offline violence and offline polarization. So although there is a variety of different evidence around this, there is so much feeling in the population that this kind of hate and this kind of polarization is associated with social media. And based on our studies, we think there's something to that. So Germany, like a lot of the nations that we studied, seems to have a fair amount of hateful content online, often targeted at minorities. That seems to have in some cases resulted in offline violence, and also seems to be associated with these more far-right parties and perspectives. Can you tell me about some of what you saw within the German context in the EU election?
Yes, I think Germany is a really interesting case from amongst our research, because it starts the online space, the freedom to post online starts from quite robust freedom of speech laws, which is a positive starting place. But what this has led to is this speech becoming increasingly polarized and toxic online. A study that was recently published found that more than half of people online had been exposed to content which they found to be hateful. And the same group of people claimed for themselves that they would be less likely to post content of a political nature themselves for fear of this hateful response from the online discussion. The same study also found that this hate was directed mostly towards politicians, but very close behind them, it was directed towards asylum seekers within Germany. So you can kind of see the groups that are most typically demonized within online rhetoric. But I think the important thing to think about this is that this group of people, more than half, which are scared away from posting online about political content, are probably those voices which are more moderate, which is exactly what we've been discussing with this structures of online discussion. The toxicity which already exists drowns out those voices which would perhaps have a more nuanced view or take a more moderate view on the progression going on, which leads to the other side of the coin, which is the extremism. So Germany has also, and it's been discussed within politics and within different ministries, but Germany is also seeing this rise of extremist content online, which goes beyond the freedoms of speech covered within the German constitution. So it is causally defined by the language, the rhetoric online, but it is increasingly addressed also to the online audience. So there was the attack in Halle in 2019 on a synagogue with a single attacker who published the entire attack on a stream on Twitch. And he spoke in English, not to a German audience, but to an English-speaking audience during this recording. And I think that's the important thing that we need to remember, is that this extremism and this rhetoric is also directed inwards towards the internet. And so what we're seeing is this mirroring of the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing online and the violence that is part of this toxicity online spreading into the real world.
So the Indian case and the Indian election is a particularly interesting one, I think, around these themes of polarization and hate speech and offline violence, particularly because, firstly, Modi has been in power for so long there. So we're seeing a system that's further into its sort of right-wing authoritarian, like populist leader. And also because of this sort of unique history of diversity and religion, and India's status as just such a huge and diverse country that some of these issues of hate speech and polarization seem so much more pronounced there. Can you talk a little bit more about how these issues played out in the 2024 election?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the situation in India is unique because you have in that situation two large entities, the Indian state and Meta itself, that mutually benefit from the existing situation. So on the one hand, in the government, we have the BJP that tolerate misinformation. A large amount of misinformation attacks their political enemies and rivals. A lot of misinformation is pro-Modi. For example, there was a fake news article that spread virally, suggested that Modi had personally intervened to pause the Ukraine-Russia conflict to allow Indian international students to leave safely. And a lot of the pro-Modi content takes what has been the long-term structural importance of India on the global stage and personalizes it. So it's Modi that's the reason that India is becoming more and more important on the global stage in this multipolar world, rather than it just being a long-term economic and cultural issue that India collectively has managed to attain. And the other side of this is that for Meta, India is its largest market. So it's not in Meta's interest to upset the government or have too many harsh penalties or regulations put upon it. In terms of polarization, we can't really talk about this without talking about the Muslim population. So a large number of the conspiracy theories and misinformation in India are about the Muslim population. So we have love jihad, which is this claim that Muslim men are seducing Hindu women to convert them to Islam. We have land jihad, which is this idea that Muslims are intentionally buying as much land as possible to become the majority shareholders of India, property holders in India. We have corona jihad, which is this suggestion that Muslims were spitting in food to spread coronavirus, yet somehow themselves being impervious to it. And what's particularly interesting about this in terms of the media landscape is that the second one, land jihad, came originally from traditional media. So there is this kind of recursive, mutually reinforcing system in which hashtags will be talked about on late night news discussions. They themselves will create hashtags. They will go back into this kind of system of attention. So both traditional and new forms of media are thriving off the incentivization structures of algorithms.
So Juan, tell me about how these processes of online polarization and hate speech leading to offline effects and affecting the political process played out in Mexico, particularly around the election last year.
Well, online polarization in Mexico during the election was very prevalent. The public was divided into visible camps, one against the fourth transformation, this movement headed by the former president López Obrador, and the other supporting this movement. And both camps were constantly exchanging insults, and for instance, on one group said the others were lazy, they were stupid, they were ignorant, and the others say that they were privileged and they were trying to support an elite that won't benefit from. They won't give them any benefit. But perhaps the worst part of This toxicity on social media was gender-based hate speech. We witnessed constant attacks on candidates, female candidates, especially the two leading presidential candidates. They were constantly questioned about their suitability to become Mexican president only because they were women. And at some point, Claudia Sheinbaum, that was elected candidate, was questioned about being a puppet of former President López Obrador. And this violence reached to the point that the Electoral Authority documented more than 300 cases of gender violence. Not all of these were on social media platforms, but we cannot know or discard how many were not influenced by this rhetoric on social media. Although there were specific cases, for instance, one where a female candidate, filed a complaint before the Electoral Authority, and the election had to be nullified because the extent of the gender violence that they found on social media, specifically on Facebook. So these are cases that are becoming more and more recurrent in the Mexican election processes.
So the UK has a long history of a reasonably polarized media system with both specifically left and right aligned traditional media platforms. So these trends that we are seeing around social media of online polarization and offline polarization might have specific interesting implications in the UK that already had such a polarized media. What did we find as part of the project within the 2024 election in the UK around these issues?
Yeah, I mean, so what we found is obviously the political, ideological, separation between left and right. And we also saw that kind of broadsheet tabloidization that occurs in social media where, the sensationalism, travels faster than long-form fact-checking and investigative reporting. I suppose the most extreme example of that happened immediately after the election in Southport, where there was a tragic attack that happened on a children's dance class. And we saw two kinds of social media working together to spread misinformation, because we had a Wake Up Southport Telegram channel filled with members of the far right, mobilizing and planning a march, but also planning to spread misinformation about the attacker on the public-facing social media platforms. So we had a deluge of posts around the attack, around the march, being spread to very popular, but nonetheless far-right misinformation spreading accounts, which then led up into violence happening all over the country. So much so that the government had to, release a statement after the fact. Yeah, so that's kind of a post-election context, which provides a kind of analysis of the kind of relationship between social media and violence. If we're going back over the election and indeed previous elections, anti-immigrant sentiment has been around in the UK for obviously a long time, especially in the right-wing tabloids. And there has been this increasing professionalization of outrage, or becoming a professional grifter, somebody whose primary job is to say sensationalist things and gain a following and then monetize that following. And as long as the algorithms don't punish people for saying these kind of incendiary things, some of which are approaching unlawful in the context of the UK, we won't see any kind of end to this kind of incentivization structure. And to put even more complications or even more negative aspects to this, we now have new news channels like GB News and Talk TV, which are ostensibly designed to be cut up and put on the internet. It's the people they invite on are often internet famous, complete unknowns to somebody who wasn't familiar with Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. These people will say hurtful and hateful things, and then the clip goes viral, but the clip itself is of the show back in social media. And we see this kind of mutually reinforcing effect happening as it happens in many contexts across the world.